On behalf of Yale University and the family of Harold Bloom, Jean, David, and Daniel, I would like to welcome all of you to this memorial celebration. We come together today as a community of students and colleagues, admirers and friends. And let us be reminded of the words of Job. There is no replacing a person of wisdom. There are mines for silver and places where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth and copper is smelted from the rock. But where can wisdom be found? Where is the source of understanding? There is no replacing a person of wisdom. Today we gather as a community of mourners to wrap our collective arms around one another, acknowledging our sense of loss and celebrating a life that affected and influenced so many of us and how we live. Harold knew life with all its inevitable challenges and met them with wisdom and insight, with humor and with truth. As a teacher, our teacher, something he loved so passionately, he encouraged generations to read and search the wit and wisdom of the ages, believing that there one could find comfort and peace, solace. When I would visit, Harold would come and greet me with the words of Wallace Stevens, who, while the poet, having drifted to what he called a dark and barren place, turned to his rabbi friend with these words, "The exceeding brightness of this early sun makes me conceive how dark I have become. O Rabbi, Rabbi, fend my soul for me, and true savant of this dark nature be." Perhaps we together in our common embrace of each other and Harold's family, we can be a true savant, as in Stephen's poem, and lead each other home to a place of deeper understanding, meaning, and of comfort. Art Crane concludes his paean to sleep, death, and desire. Today I would suggest perhaps a fitting prayer for our dear Harold. He wrote, "But now draw in your head, alone and too tall here, your eyes already in the slant of drifting foam, your breath sealed by the thoughts I do not know. Draw in your head and sleep the long way home." Or perhaps his beloved mother might well have said each evening, as sleep beckoned the young child, so we say in parting, in his Mama Loshen, in his mother's language, "Harold, meine süßen Kind, schlaf gesund, sei gesund, steh auf gesund." My dear, sweet child, sleep well, be well, and arise to a place of peace and healing. And now, let us pay tribute.
Harold was the brightest star in Yale's firmament, and even that dazzling universe is too small to measure him. As a reader, critic, and teacher of literature, he was not bound by time or place. His admirers compare him not with others of his generation, but with Samuel Johnson. To be his reader is deeply enriching. To be his student, as so many have told me, was an experience to be cherished for a lifetime. Despite his Declaration of Independence from the English department more than 40 years ago, Harold loved Yale, especially its libraries, its bright and curious undergraduates, and the devoted circle of colleagues who appreciated his unique brilliance. I had the privilege of being Harold's department chair for 20 years, a role that I relished because our conversations gave him the opportunity to reminisce about Yale's history, about his early colleagues, and about my predecessors, his beloved friend Bart, with whom he had much in common, and the king he greatly admired, with whom he had nothing at all in common. Harold wrote once, several times, that we read because we cannot know enough people profoundly enough. We read to encounter difference, which enlarges our range of experience and enables us to find a common humanity. He claimed that he used 3 criteria for deciding which works he continued to read and teach: aesthetic splendor, intellectual power, and wisdom. Such works, by satisfying the mind's need for beauty, truth, and insight, enlarge us. They bring us the blessing of life and more life. 20 years ago, in How to Read and Why, Harold concludes by raising the question of how long to carry on with his work. The ready answer, written on Harold's soul from childhood, was the teaching of Rabbi Tarfon. You are not required to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. You cannot desist because the stakes of the covenant are high. The blessing of life and more life is conferred on those who persist. Yet Harold confessed fascination with the equanimity of his hero, Shakespeare, who stopped writing in 1613, 3 years before his death. In the final lines of his last play, The Two Nobles' Kinsmen, Shakespeare enjoins us to take what time remains pretty much as it comes, which means that there will come a time to desist from the work. Writing at age 69, Harold said, "I do not know whether Tarfon or Shakespeare is right." Perhaps Harold wished he had Shakespeare's equanimity, but he knew even then what was right for him. In later years, whenever asked how long he would continue to teach, he would reply, "Until they carry me out of the classroom in a body bag." In How to Read and Why, Harold tells us that there is a reader's sublime, and it seems the only secular transcendence we can ever attain, except for the even more precarious transcendence we call falling in love. Harold was surely familiar with the reader's sublime. He and Jean were also familiar with the other form of transcendence, and there was nothing precarious about it. Jean, your patience and love sustained Harold, eased his pain in these recent years of ill health, and made it possible for continuing to do what he loved, reading, writing, and teaching with energy and passion until the very end. You gave him the strength he needed, not to complete the work, but neither to desist from it.
Over the years, our conversations roamed from books to sports to jazz. Harold, I've been living inside this book of yours, The Anatomy of Influence. I miss the old title, The Living Labyrinth, partly because it's so perfect for the way your mind works. All that stuff inside, talking to itself.
Pardon me, oh noble Chris, is it not the way that your mind works also?
Well, with much less in it.
All of us literary cultural types are labyrinthine in our complexities, aren't we?
Well, yes.
And I dare say that your marvelous body of auditors who will listen to this in some form or another after you have edited it down, I dare say they are labyrinthine in their complexities also. Their sinuosities, you might want to say.
Absolutely. But most of us are thinking of the names of rock and roll drummers or baseball players or boxers from the 1930s or something.
I also, as a wretched Yankee fan, because I think they're awful this year, I can take you back throughout Yankee history. Every minor league creature who showed up as a reserve infielder, I can tell you all about. this is not a good year for that. The Red Sox are going to beat us by about 15 games.
Let's hope. Let's hope. They're finally in a groove.
I don't hope it. I loathe it. The fascist Red Sox, I always call them.
Why?
If you want biography or autobiography or memoir, at the age of 6 in 1936, my splendid Uncle Sam Kaplan took me to my first big league game in Yankee Stadium. It was on my birthday, so I was 6 years old. There was a rookie in left field. He switched to center field the next year, named Joseph Paul DiMaggio. And like all potential Yankee fans, I said, oh my God, look at him. But wait, he has inspired my life to a considerable degree, even though he wasn't obviously a very charming human being from everything one knows about him and his relation to poor old Marilyn and so on.
Baseball made an easy analogy for Bloom's most famous book, The Anxiety of Influence, and the idea that writers are formed by a contest with their elders and betters. I asked him once if the poet's distress growing up was much different from, say, Mickey Mantle's awareness that he was playing at Yankee Stadium in Joe DiMaggio's center field. No difference at all, said Harold Bloom. Go back to your papa. In the ballpark,
yes.
In the Bronx.
No, that was my Uncle Sam. He took me to Yankee Stadium. Also, he influenced my life because I remember one day when I was about 10 or 11, I was spending all my time reading Hart Crane and Shakespeare and John Milton and Walt Whitman, you know, the poets who mattered. And he said to me, Harala, which is what they called me, what are you going to do with all this when you grow up? I think I was about 11 at the time. What are you going to do with this? I said, well, I don't know. I just want to read poems and talk about them, and I hope write about them. I hadn't written about them as yet.
Harold, I was going to ask you, what would your father make of you? What you have mastered, what you have learned, what you have
Papa
written?
had no idea. He said to me one day in Yiddish, he said, what are you doing? What do you intend to be? A malamed? Yiddish for a school teacher. I said, well, again in Yiddish, yeah, Papa, but on a somewhat higher level, I hope. He said, no. He said, anything better than that. If you don't want to be a doctor and a lawyer, as you should be, you're wasting all this education. Better you should be a pharmacist than a malamed. So I don't think he would have been much moved or much interested or much impressed.
Would he understand how you did it? How you mastered that material?
My dear fellow, I don't understand how I did it. The ultimate truth about me, which I think I would say only to Chris Lydon, because notoriously I love the man, and I believe you somewhat reciprocate my fierce affections.
I do.
I have no idea how it all happened.
So Harold said he didn't know how it all happened, and we're going to take a look at how that might have been. But first, I thought it would be a good idea if we had all of Harold's students, I think he would like this, all of Harold's students who are here, please to stand up. That's almost everybody. Now, please stay standing, and if anybody was his assistant, either with a computer or drove him or something like that, please rise and join. And finally, that's almost everybody, honestly, but then if there are any colleagues, please stand and rise, any Yale colleagues as well. I think Harold would feel so wonderful about being surrounded by everybody. And so thank you all for coming. And now we're going to have a little bit of a photographic review of Harold. So this is Harold's beloved mother, Paula. And on the left, you see Harold, and on the right is his oldest brother. They were immigrants. His mother was from Brest-Litovsk, and they spoke only Yiddish, as Harold said in that piece. And here is Harold's whole family. His father and mother in the center. His father was a garment worker. He was from Odessa. And surrounding his mother and father are his three sisters who made a very big difference to him. Harold is on the right in front. His brother is next to him. His older brother is next to him. And Harold's sisters made a big difference for him because they really encouraged his reading. They got him to the Bronx Public Library. Then they got him to the Fordham Library. And it was there that he really discovered Crane and Blake. For his 10th birthday, they gave him a gold and black edition of Blake, which I think he cherished forever. This is Harold on the right with his older brother and his 3 sisters. I think they're very, very nice looking, and he loved them, Estelle and his other 2 sisters. And here's Harold when he was at Bronx Science. Now, you have to know that at Bronx Science, Harold was not a good student. You can just imagine, did you do your calculus homework, Harold? Have you written your English paper rather than reading all night Blake and Crane? Probably Harold wasn't, really Johnny on the spot with all of that. But everything changed. And by the way, he was there with John Hollander, who was not in the same class, and also with Shep Newland, who we're going to see in a moment. So think what this school was like at that time. And Harold wasn't a good student, and his counselor thought that maybe he ought to go to Albany State Teachers College. But then he took the Regents exams and came out #1 in New York State. And people took another look at him, and that changed everything. Here's a closer look of him there. So if you did do so well in the Regents, you could go to Cornell. And that's where Harold ended up. I love the story about when he went to Cornell, he saw a cow and he had absolutely no idea. He was terrified by it. He had no idea what he was looking at. But Cornell turned out to be a wonderful and magical place for him, just the absolute perfect place to go. And here's one of the reasons why. Look at this genial, loving, wonderful man. I know there are Cornell people in the audience, M.H. Abrams, who Harold said about him, "In the deep sense, I owe my teaching and writing career to Mike. He fathered me during my difficult undergraduate years at Cornell. I was rough, shy, highly self-conscious, and parenthetic. His care and knowledge gave me the control to harness my energy without crippling it." So he was not only a fatherly sort, but he was also, of course, a romantic scholar. He had been a Harvard graduate, but he wasn't influenced by Eliot and formalism. He always believed there was something else. And he loved Shelley, and he loved Blake. So Harold found himself in this place with somebody who could not only be kind and welcoming to him, but could help him foster what was innate in him. So this turned out to be a wonderful thing. Here's a picture of him in a Yiddish newspaper on graduating from Cornell. And I love this because right below this on the page, there is a picture of Shep Newland, who was graduating from NYU, the author of How We Die, a great Yale figure, a great Yale doctor. And, these people coming out of Bronx High School and NYU and Cornell at this time are just incomparably brilliant. Well, after Cornell, Harold ended up at Yale. And good gosh, how lucky that he ended up at Yale and not at Harvard. I have to think that M.H. Abrams probably had something to do with that, because Harvard was still in the world of Eliot and formalism. I don't know that Harold would have found as much sympathie there as he did. He had a lot of luck in being at Cornell and then at Yale, I think, where he could find wonderful mentors. And there is one great one. This is the wonderful Fred Pottle. Pottle was known for being the great Boswell scholar. But people forget that before he was a Boswell scholar, he was a Shelley scholar. His life was transformed when at Colby College he discovered Shelley. And he early wrote a book on Shelley and the influence of Shelley on Browning. So once again, Harold had found somebody who could foster and help nurture. He went beyond all of these people in Romanticism, but they made a great influence. And like M.H. Abrams, look at the face of that man. I mean, gentle, sweet, wonderful, as well as brilliant. Another man that Harold liked very much at Yale was William Clyde Devane, 25 years, dean of Yale College, Browning scholar. And I don't know if anybody here will recognize this, but this is the young W. Kurtz Wimsatt. And Wimsatt was Harold's teacher. He always challenged Harold, and Harold challenged him right back. They had a challenging relationship, but because Harold was so brilliant and Wimsatt was so brilliant, they could feed off one another and did. So these people around Yale were actually very, very good mentors for someone who was nevertheless a totally independent spirit. He then went to Pembroke College in Cambridge, and he loved it. Jean tells me that he made friends there, he drank, he ate, he talked, he went to the high table, he did everything wonderful, except what he was supposed to do, which was to write his dissertation. So apparently he wrote it on the boat on the way back because he was Harold, and you couldn't start teaching at Yale unless you had finished your dissertation. And then he ended up as a residential fellow of all places at Jonathan Edwards College. That was a place where I'm so proud that Jean and Harold were actually married in this residential fellow suite in Jonathan Edwards. And here are Harold and Jean in their youth. Is that a wonderful picture or what? They're kids. They're kids, and they're so adorable and wonderful. And there's another one of them looking at one another. Now, this picture has been seen often, but it deserves much, much attention. This is the English department in the 1960s, and people here know this picture very well. I will point out, Harold is second from the end in the back row. He's standing next to Norman Holmes Pearson. And I will point out something interesting I found. All his friends are on the right, and all his enemies are on the left. All his friends and his warm personal enemies are on the right. So you have Tom Green and R.W.B. Lewis. And in front, the only man who's wearing a sports jacket is Pottle. And on the other side, you have some of the older people. Harold could tell you how every single one of these people voted on his tenure. And he has told that story very often. This is Harold and Jean as they leave Yale for Harold's Morse year. They spent half the year in London, and Jeffrey and Renee Hartman were in Israel, and then Jean and Harold went to Israel in the second half of their time. There's a close picture of them. So beautiful, Jean, you're so beautiful. And here's Harold as a father with Daniel and David. And now I'm going to just show you a quick succession of pictures that I think are so wonderful. Doesn't he look like the New York intellectual? Very, very. And I feel about Harold the way I felt about John, that he didn't leave New York, he brought New York with him to New Haven. And I wanted pictures of him smiling and engaging. I think that's a wonderful one. And look at him laughing joyfully there, also good. And here, I think, you know how he called everybody Little Bear? I suddenly realized he was the big bear. And these are the photographs of him that show that. My favorite picture of all, for many years, Harold would sit in that chair with his yellow pads and write. Jean would be in the chair across from him. In the latter years, that changed. But I think it's a wonderful picture of him. And this is my picture of Harold and Jean in the 1970s. It's at John and Natalie Hollander's house on Canner Street. And I think it's a wonderful picture, and I'm very proud I took it. And I just had to include this because Harold cherished this signed picture with the Yankees. I don't know why anybody likes the Yankees, but he did. I love this picture. This is John Hollander on the left, sort of looking like, I know everything, ask me anything. In the middle is Jeffrey Hartman looking very rabbinical and also very wise. And then there's Zero Mostel on the right, Harold in his Zumba way, and the three buds together. The brain power in that particular area would be scarifying. And this is, I just had to show this is Jeffrey and Renee Hartman on their wedding day. What a picture. What a picture. I didn't recognize Jeffrey, but look how beautiful Renee looks. And there's another picture of it. And here is Harold's beloved Angus Fletcher, of whom he said, "Angus taught me that poetic imagination is a holy fire." He loved Angus and never got over his death. And here's Harold with Archie Ammons. What I'm showing you now are pictures of people who would be up here speaking if they were alive, but none of them are. So very important to Harold and Jean were their friendship with the Ammons and Harold's enjoyment and love of Archie Ammons' poetry. And here is Harold and John Hollander with Frank Kermode in the middle. I notice nobody's arm is around Frank Kermode, as in the other picture. And here is Harold, I think on an Institute Academy jury. Jimmy Merrill is in back with his hand on Harold. Hortense Kalischer. I think that's Ann Beatty. That's definitely Donald Justice. On the right is Mark Strand. And I have no idea who the tall man is. I'm sure somebody in this room does. But again, it's Harold laughing, enjoying, a wonderful picture of him. And another jury, Library of America. He is, I put it here because Sandy McClatchy's in the back with him. Mark Rudin and Joan Richardson, and John, Mark Strand. And this is something, this was the Bollingen, I put this here for a reason, it's the Bollingen poets. And people think that, Harold didn't have a wide range in poetry. Yes, his canon was his canon, but he loved many kinds of poetry. And for example, this is Dick Wilbur with John Ashbery in front. Creeley and Snyder are on either end. I'm not sure that they were Harold's favorites, but Dick Wilbur was, and Merwin, John, and Mark Strand. And here's Harold with Ron Dworkin, the jurist and philosopher, getting an honorary degree at Bologna, I think. And here's Harold with John Ashbery in the middle and John Hollander on the time when John Ashbery received an honorary degree from Yale quite recently. And we had to have this here, Bloom, de Man, Derrida, Hartman, and Miller, Deconstruction and Criticism. Harold was fond of saying that they were deconstruction and he was criticism. But the top picture is Harold with Derrida, and of course Hillis Miller, Jeffrey Hartman, and Paul de Man. And here's Harold with Jonathan Spence, who's here today, whom he loves so much. And here he is with Jonathan and An Ping, also a great, great friend of his, somebody he adored. And this I had to have here. This is Leslie Brisman and his wife Susan on their wedding day. And I take this moment on behalf of everyone here to thank Leslie, who so many times stepped in for Harold when it was needful. Other people did it, we all tried to help, but Leslie was the star. His punctilious way of grading papers when it was necessary, his way of taking hold meant so much to all of us who loved Harold. And here's Harold with Maria Menachal. She and Norma Thompson made such a happy home for him at the Whitney Humanities Center. And David Bromwich, David, who is here today and who's speaking, whom Harold called his greatest student with An Ping. And I just thought, just a little, there are so many of his students who aren't here. He's just a little handful of people who aren't Yaleys. And are some may be here today, but the late Barbara Packer on the right, Willie Flash and Laura Herb Marks, who's not here, but in Europe, Ken Gross, John Burt. There are just hundreds of students all over the country. And this is at a party. This is Peter Cole and Adina Hoffman, Emily Bakemeyer, and Jonathan Spence at one of the two parties that would happen every year, one on Jean's birthday in January and one on Harold's in July. And there was always lots to eat and presents and lots to drink, and there was always a King Kong poem and a Fay Ray poem to go along with the celebration. And who could not love this picture? Harold and Jean, this is where they were so often in the last years. Harold working at one end of the table, Jean at the other. I believe this is Susan Spiro and Gary Heller's dog, Cooper, relaxing under the table. And it's such a peaceful, wonderful picture. There are always flowers, and there were always food, and there was always the warmth of the orange curtains and the light, and the peace of Harold and Jean working together. And this is the last. Harold and Jean, quite recently, it's January, I see the snow outside, and Jean they're drinking champagne, and I like it because Harold is smiling broadly. And I'm going to leave this photograph up because it's characteristically Harold, and I'm going to end with just a few lines from Stevens, this poem that I first heard Harold do when I audited his course many, many years ago. The Idea of Order at Key West. I heard him do the whole poem in 2 hours, one class. So the end of Idea of Order. Ramon Fernandez, tell me if you know why, when the singing ended and we turned toward the town, tell why the glassy lights, the lights in the fishing boat at anchor there, mastered the night as night descended, tilting in the air, mastered the night and portioned out the sea, fixing emblazoned zones and fiery poles, arranging, deepening, enchanting night. Oh, blessed rage for order, pale Ramon, the maker's rage to order words of the sea, words of the fragrant portals dimly starred, and of ourselves and of our origins in ghostlier demarcations, keener sounds.
While he was alive, it often seemed to me that Harold Bloom wrote books faster than I could read them. I counted 29 books that he gave to me in proof for me to read, and often by the time I got them back to him, he was already handing me the next one. He usually took the copyright corrections, almost never took the substantive corrections, but that was Harold. Now that he's gone, I'm having almost as much trouble keeping up with the remembrances and obituaries, so I'm not going to try to compete with them, and instead would like to just share a couple of short anecdotes from over the years and representing his various intellectual interests. The first one takes us back to 1968 at Cornell. He was teaching a seminar to faculty and a couple of us privileged graduate students. And the poem was Keats's Ode to Psyche. They lay calm breathing on the bedded grass, their arms embraced, and their pinions too. Their lips touched not, but had not bade adieu, as if disjoined by soft-handed slumber, and ready still past kisses to outnumber. And in that group was an assistant professor who spoke about those lines, about their arms embraced and their pinions too, and couldn't get over that embrace. She went on and on about, you might, if you're lucky in this life, find a man who will embrace you, but only the arms, and never that kind of total embrace, the arms and the pinions too. And I was so embarrassed. I remember covering my face with my hands and thinking, oh God, how is Harold going to get through this class? And afterwards I went up to him and said, you handled that so beautifully. I was so embarrassed. And he said, oh, there was nothing embarrassing about that. It was very poignant, as he insisted on mispronouncing that word. He said, she really got Keats. And it's not one virgin sensibility understanding the passion of another virgin sensibility. It's because she's a Spencerian. My second tale comes from a number of years later. I'm teaching at Yale, and I want to consult Harold on Tintern Abbey to make sure that I understand the relationship between the two recompenses that Wordsworth finds for having lost what he had in childhood and grown up. Other gifts have followed. For such loss, I would believe abundant recompense. One, for I have learned to look on nature not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. Two, and I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky and in the mind of man. So just to make sure that I had this right, I said to Harold, I think I understand Jeffrey Hartman to be the great prophet of the first recompense, the still sad music of humanity, the sympathy with others' suffering, and you to be the great prophet of the second, the sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused. Harold, no, my dear, I am the prophet of both. I was a little horrified at his arrogance and got up from the sofa in that wonderful living room and made for the door. And Harold came after me and whispered, "So is Jeffrey." My third comes from a visit to Harold after the publication of Poetry and Repression, and I did not know how to express my utter astonishment at this book of the great theoretical trilogy. I said, Harold, Poetry and Repression revolutionizes the study of poetry. This is a new heaven and a new earth. And Harold said, no, my dear, this is an apocalypse only in the sense that Shelley's Spirit of the Earth spoke about, and then quoting from memory, those ugly human shapes and visages of which I spoke as having wrought me pain, passed floating through the air and fading still into the winds that scattered them, and those from whom they passed seemed mild and lovely forms after some foul disguise had fallen, and all were somewhat changed. That is the only sense in which my writing is apocalyptic. Unlike the feminists and the cultural critics and the new historicists, I am not in for a big apocalypse. I only want to do to new criticism a small, somewhat small change. The next comes from my efforts to introduce one of my dissertation students, David Bromwich's dissertation student, to Harold, who was writing a dissertation on D.H. Lawrence, and I thought this young man needs to meet the scholar of D.H. Lawrence. So I brought Paul to the Bloom's house, and the conversation turns to Bavarian gentians, and Harold recites the poem from memory, but he recites Persephone herself is but a voice of a darkness visible, enfolded in the deeper dark of arms plutonic. And Paul, who knows the poem quite well, says, it's darkness invisible. Harold, Milton wrote darkness visible. Lawrence wrote darkness invisible. And Harold said, no, that can't be right. Jean gets up, goes to the bookshelf, brings out the volume of Lawrence, and says, Harold, Paul is right. You know, the anxiety of influence, have you heard of that? Lawrence wrote darkness invisible because he's, you know, as you would say, misreading Milton. And Harold said, well, darkness visible is what he should have written. I have to tell you this one because the Bible is one of those subjects that I have taught for years and that Harold told me not to. He would say, you know, you're going to ruin your career if you start teaching the Bible. He also told me not to teach Shakespeare because there was nothing new to be said about it. Okay, so we get to this passage in chapter 19 of Exodus, the revelation on Sinai. And the Lord said unto Moses, go down and charge the people, lest they break through unto the Lord to gaze, and many of them perish. And Moses said unto the Lord, he's just been up and down, up and down, up and down the mountain. He doesn't want to go down again. He'd have to walk up again. And Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up the mountain, for you've already charged them, saying, set bounds about the mountain and sanctify it. Harold had written about this passage that it reflects God's anxiety about confronting the people as a whole. And I said to him, Harold, are you aware that another great Yale biblical scholar, John Van Cedars, believes that this passage is written by the priestly writer, not by Jay, and it's not about the anxiety of confronting the people? And Harold said, no, he's wrong. It's written by the Jay writer. This is very, very Jay. I said, so Harold, you're going to insist on a God who has OCD, who can't defecate without checking again that the bathroom door is locked? He doesn't want to talk to Moses until he makes sure that the people are down at the bottom of the mountain. And Harold looks absolutely shocked at me. And he said, you mustn't talk like that. He said, I'm horrified. You should know better than that. You could be as reverent as you want about God, but don't you mention OCD or those litigious students will sue you. My last one, I have to give you one from Harold the Shakespearean. This is late Harold. He's returning to King Lear, and he's writing about the last scene of King Lear. Lear dies saying, look there, deceived that Cordelia is still alive. Edgar, he faints. My lord. Kent, break heart, I prithee break. And Harold says that Kent, like a good physician, knows when it's time to cut off life support and tells Lear, enough already. I say, Harold, you can't say that. You can't say that. Kent is talking about his own heart breaking. Remember solipsism? It's Kent talking about Kent. It's not Kent talking to Lear. You can't say that. Harold, you can't say that. I can.
He enters as himself. I believe it is his only major poem in which he allows himself to enter in his proper person as a kind of dramatic figure. The great beach scene in the early cantos or sections of the auroras of autumn. He stares at the extraordinary display of the northern lights, the vitality, the color, the power of the aurora borealis is a terrible reproach to his own waning vitality, not just as an imagination, but as a potent male or aging human being, or to his own terrible sense of indeed turning blankly on the sand, of being a visible or audible blank, nothing more and nothing less. And he gathers himself together. He tries to make the supreme effort of his poetry to reduce what he confronts to what he calls a first idea or new point of origin, and then to reimagine that idea and take the reduction and the reimagination together and say, look, this is my poem, this is my act of creation. So he cries out about the auroras, these glorious northern lights. He cries out, this is nothing, and the this is means the northern lights. This is nothing until in a single man contained. Nothing until this named thing, the auroras, nameless is and is destroyed. And suddenly he becomes wholly self-referential, and he says of himself, he opens the door of his house on flames. That is to say, you've made your supreme effort, you fling open the door of your spirit, of your whole being, of everything you've taught yourself to write and be. You fling it open, and at just that moment, the northern lights say, all right, if you wish to defy us, now you get our full flare. And flames suddenly light up. The whole sky is absolutely aflame. The scholar of one candle sees an arctic effulgence flare upon the frame of everything he is, and he feels afraid. That is to say, you make the supreme effort of your own imagination, and all the intensity and power and discipline, genius of your imagination only makes you more fearful rather than less fearful.
The day I found out Harold Bloom died, I flooded my house. A close friend had called to tell me she read of his death in the paper, and I proceeded upstairs to take comfort and to contemplate my great teacher in a bath, when, just as I was opening the faucet, I thought of the many people I had to inform, ran back downstairs to do so, and returned upstairs an hour later to find waves in the bathroom and hallways, and water pouring downstairs into my study, bath water raining, crashing through the ceiling, dripping, sliding over the walls, seeping over the bookcases and books, and soaking through the study floor to the rooms in the basement. A flood of tears, I thought, the sorrow I could not yet express through my eyes, possessing my entire house, a catastrophe of grief at the loss of my great teacher and dear friend, a very real but also tropological event that I knew Harold would understand. Or perhaps less metaphorically, it was a literal reenactment of a similar flood I now suddenly recalled, one I had created in the bathroom and hall on the second floor of the Hall of Graduate Studies at Yale, my first year as a graduate student, the year I would have met Harold as my teacher. My current watery waste, returning me to the time of that great scene of instruction by which, as Harold tells us, we are chosen by a text or by a teacher, or rather by a great and inimitable teaching. Harold's work had indeed chosen me and has continued to impress itself upon my thought and writing, and now apparently my house, for the past 4 decades, and undoubtedly for more to come. And yet, maybe more simply and more poetically, the seeping flood in my rooms brought back something more personal and poetic of Harold himself, his endearing habit of confirming our later appointments when we were colleagues with the ironically self-descriptive words, quote, "My dear, I will ooze on over," end quote. Were it only Harold himself that my sorrow and the great unconscious brought oozing back into my house last October. But in spite of the months of repair in front of me, I take comfort in what Harold himself taught us, that the catastrophes wrought by our imaginations can also be, sometimes more and sometimes less, creations, as they are the mind's revenge against time, the unconscious's satanic but also poetic struggle against the universe of death. The sublimity and irony of this human and poetic condition are inextricably entangled throughout Harold's work and are exemplified for me by the clearest memory I have from his teaching. Not the memory of an interpretation or a theory, but of a laugh. Harold's chuckles as he found an irresistible humor at the heart of Freud's notion of all things, traumatic repetition compulsion, a moment that would undoubtedly mark indelibly my own future work on trauma and place it forever in relation to the creativity of survival. Harold's laugh that day indeed brought together a catastrophe and a creation, the sublime breakthrough by which Freud wrested from his earlier work his discovery of trauma, and the unwitting manner in which Freud revealed himself at one particular moment in his great text Beyond the Pleasure Principle, to be himself the exemplar of trauma's repetitions, the very example of the man who, as Freud says in the passage Harold read aloud to us that day, is doomed to suffer the repeated betrayal by his disciples. That would be Carl Jung, Harold chuckled. Only Harold could teach us to read Freud's own catastrophic creation in this manner. Or by this, Harold's outrageous and sublime juxtaposition in one of my favorite of his essays, Wrestling Sigmund, of the Yahweh's portrayal of Jacob wrestling the angel and receiving the blessing of the name Israel, and Freud's description of the baby at the breast, resting from the instinct of hunger, a drive, erotic or poetic, that frees the little human from the constraints of need and turns him or her toward the future. Jacob receives a sublime name, though he limps from the wound the angel has inflicted upon his hip. And Freud's own struggle with the angel, of death, of time, of the merely normative, creates the world and the words by which we will name, even as we repeat, our catastrophic beginnings. But it is Harold who has indeed given us, as readers of the Bible, of Freud, of the entire poetic tradition, of ourselves, inevitably the words, the names by which we are blessed and doomed as readers and human beings. Though the names Harold gave were not always divine names, I must add. I was anointed at the opening of my Ph.D. orals exam in front of all the other luminaries about to test me, Pookie Bear, along with a pat on the head by the stocking-footed Harold. All of Harold's colleagues were similarly anointed by a series of names that the wonderful Jean will recall from the many afternoons we all spent in their living room drinking sherry, names neither Jean nor I should or will repeat. And my first published collection on trauma was in precisely 1 minute of meditation with his head in his hands, anointed by Harold the title, Trauma Explorations in Memory, a creation undoubtedly wresting eternity from the catastrophe of the title I had previously chosen for it. A few days after the flood that my grief at the loss of Harold and my unconscious created in my house, I had a dream that brought home in another way the reality of Harold's death, of the creativity and the names and the intractable originality, as he would have called it, he gave us. In it, I asked in despair, who will be here now to say the divine Oscar Wilde? Who will now pronounce these names? I wish I could turn to Harold for the answer to this loss. Harold, who once sublimely reminded me, after what I considered the catastrophe of a breakup with a lover, my dear, as Freud says, object libido was once ego libido and can always become ego libido again. But no such return to the ego is quite possible, I find, in the face of Harold's death. We are left, nonetheless, now to name the divine Harold and to contemplate the memories, the writings, the flood, and the hope for his perhaps sometimes wounding, but always a sublime blessing. I will end with words he quotes in Wrestling Sigmund from Whitman. This is thy hour, O soul, thy free flight into the wordless, away from books, away from art, the day erased, the lesson done. Thee fully emerging, silent, gazing, pondering, these thou lovest best, night, sleep, death, and the stars.
I had read and admired essays by Harold Bloom before I studied with him, and gotten into the habit of looking closely at poems he recommended. So our association, you might say, was overdetermined from the start. A relationship, a friendship, as long-lasting as almost any in my life. But I was shy, or anyway, socially underdeveloped. There were plenty of good literature courses here, and I suppose it's possible I would have ended up never taking one from Bloom just because I admired his writing so much. But my college roommate audited one or two sessions of his seminar on American poetry and brought back an impression. Bloom says interesting things. Like what? He said, the idea of order at Key West is one of those works of art that begin all at once with a complete thought like Brahms's Fourth Symphony. Well, that was interesting. Also unexpected and intuitive and true. I signed up for his seminar the following year. Some way into the term, we began talking together outside class, occasionally in his office hours, or I would come along the first few blocks of his way home. We talked a lot about contemporary poetry, and especially John Ashbery, by no means a household name in 1972, as he would become a decade or so later. I think we were both amazed at how much we agreed about favorite poems and favorite lines in the work of a great many poets. There was too much agreement, maybe. Something had to be done about that. And I wouldn't have said it at the time that I was testing him, but my first year in grad school, Harold said, if you go anywhere but Yale, you'll end up in Oshkosh. I wrote a parody of The Anxiety of Influence, a made-up revisionary ratio to go with the 6 with exotic names that he'd invented for that book. It only struck me much later that this was taking a risk. My first year in grad school was, to put it mildly, not a success and not a happy time. And if Harold hadn't been amused at the fun I was having with his extravagance, my academic career would have ended early. Or maybe it wasn't such a risk after all, because though he was an enthralling personality with a great voice, an imposing intellect, who was consistently impressive and wanted to impress, his way of taking himself was never stiff or solemn. When Bloom told you to brood on an idea or an argument, he meant ponder, think hard, put yourself into it, but not adopt an air of profundity and say important things. Brooding was not relaxing, however. Harold might be at ease when talking to visitors late afternoons in his recliner chair on Linden Street, but one was not led to picture that as his usual posture. Once on his walk home from the library, encountering a group of us lounging on the grass on cross campus, he stopped and commented, "A scene of frenzied composition, I see." An affectionate admonition, that was, to novices supposed to be hard at work writing our chapters. But it's true that Harold himself, in real daytime hours, seemed always employed in teaching or in energetic, if not frenzied, composition. He put into practice Emerson's doctrine of teaching as encouragement and conveyed it with an emphasis that was completely his own. The peculiarity and enchantment of his way of teaching poetry has been well described in one or two of the eulogies I've seen, but it came to seem so natural in my experience that I'm probably the last person who could say what made it so strange, delicate, original, taxing, and unforgettable. The best I can do is to repeat, as others have said, that his teaching centered on questions. The questions were about language and its relation to life, and they could search the depth of a single word or quite a long stretch of words. And the questions led to no certain conclusion. They were a stimulus, an incitement, something to brood on. He dramatized his questions so subtly that one had the feeling of a conversation, even when he did much of the talking. An auditor of a seminar once heard Harold mutter when it was over and he was packing up, "I didn't like the way it went today." "What do you mean?" she said. "You asked the questions and you gave the answers." I didn't care for the answers. For all his enormous self-confidence and the legitimate and widening fame he enjoyed from his late 40s on, I don't think that Harold ever grew complacent. He kept on looking for fresh clues to the large subjects that occupied his thinking and teaching and writing. British Romanticism, the American self from Emerson to Stevens, Gnosticism, Freud, the Bible, Shakespeare. These studies, which had commenced at different moments but never let go of him once they took hold, were sufficient reward for a mind that was never much clogged by vanity. And vanity distinguished from egotism. Sorry, I'm going to teach for one moment here. Harold was a great egotist, but he wasn't vain. A vain person wants you to be always talking about him and flattering him every minute. That wasn't Harold. He didn't particularly want his students either to resemble him, or so it seems to me, but I should only speak for myself. I had planned a dissertation on poetic influence, or rather the influence of critics on poets, beginning with Hazlitt and Keats, proceeding to Ruskin and Tennyson, and somehow going on from there. It was a topic, as I now realize, deeply, if indirectly, flattering to Harold. But when he read my first chapter with warm approval and encouragement, he said in passing, "You should write as much as you like about Hazlitt. You are obviously happy when you're writing about him." This was liberating advice, and I've tried to follow its example with the dissertations I have supervised. Tell them to do what they have it at heart to do, even if it means reading between the lines of what they think they ought to do. The first few years back at Yale, for my wife and me with a small child, were a bit unsettled and lonely. She said to me once, "Maybe there isn't any social life in New Haven, but if there is, we sure aren't seeing it." At that time, Harold and Jean were a huge exception. They offered a sort of continuous, easy welcome I will never forget. And Harold did it in the lightest way imaginable. The first day he came across me in a collegial situation at the row of faculty mailboxes in the department office, he looked up and said, "I seem to have seen you somewhere." And now Serena Wang and Ninad Ivovic will play Ernest Bloch's Nigun. Bloch was a favorite composer of Harold's, and Serena played it for him to his great pleasure shortly before he died.
As we've heard this afternoon, and to state the possibly obvious, there were many Harolds.
There was Harold the Genius,
And Harold the Notorious,
Harold the Terrible,
and Harold the Oracle,
and we knew them all well.
sometimes too well. The Harold who mattered most to us, though, was Harold the Insatiable, a man whose hunger for poetry was matched only by his appetite for engaged human company, and always on the page and in person for more life, which was, as he put it again and again till the very end, the blessing.
As for the poetry, he craved it like no one we've ever known. Once, when we were over at the house on Linden Street, just after Harold had come back from a long stay at rehab following an illness, we were sitting on the couch beside Valentina,
The Gnostic ostrich.
and talking, when Harold's gaze shifted into the distance.
He'd spotted the mailman coming up the path and interrupted me.
Peter, dear, could you get the mail?
As we heard the storm door opening and the bundles hitting the floor, I brought them over and he began ripping into envelope after envelope with his teeth and index finger, clutching his cane and ignoring us entirely. Expecting something important, I asked him. Maybe someone has sent me a great poem, he said, without looking up.
Most writers we know run the other way when other people's poems draw near. There was the great Bloom at 81 or so, just back from the brink, panting after them like a sheepdog.
Or golden retriever. The proper work of poetry, he reminds us in one of those popular books that made him unpopular, is to startle us out of our sleep death into a more capacious sense of life.
His hungers could also be quite literal. He loved to eat hearty, unfussed over food, and he was a voracious delight to cook for, precise in his cravings, emphatic in his pleasure.
Adina, your matzo balls are shocking.
Even in his later frailty, he would make very specific, slightly eccentric culinary requests, which it was almost impossible to deny him. Passing an encrypted, or at least cryptic, message through a mutual friend who'd been visiting him one afternoon to talk about John Ashbery, he told her, mysteriously, to tell us.
Persian.
Knowing we'd understand that this meant he'd like us to join forces with Jean and whip up a kuku, a choresh, and some crisp-crusted rice, which the four of us would devour around that almost always book-heaped dining room table.
Conversation around Jean and Harold's plain and potmark table were also testament to the Bloomian blessing. The first time we shared a meal alongside this somehow magical piece of furniture, we scrambled to clear the books off and make room for the plates and glasses and food.
Just leave them, Kinderlach. No need to stand on ceremony.
Over the years, the meals and conversations morphed into one another, from the page to the plate, then back to the page, and on into the previous night's Yankees game. There was also that Harold, the front-running fan from 1410 Grand Concourse in the Bronx, or to a DVD of F. Murray Abraham doing Shylock.
And then there were the Passover Seders that, for some 10 years now, we've held in that same dining room. Here, too, Harold always wanted to surprise the texture of the tradition, and he gently insists that each time we concoct a different angle onto the Out of Egypt story.
Make it new, as the rabbis urged, and as in a very different context did Ezra Pound, whom Harold loathed and we love.
The particulars were up to us, but the basic idea was to keep Harold engaged until the meal itself was served.
So it was that we celebrated together each spring in generally gleeful and often heretical fashion with Harold, Jean, Danny, David, and a variety of guests, many of them here today.
An American songbook Seder.
An Umbundist
A Yiddish
Seder.
A Kabbalistic Seder.
A Seder we described loosely as Shabbatian, that is Judeo-Islamic, Gershom Sholomanian, Antinomian, and upside-down carnivalesque.
What are we reading, Peter? You really need to write this one up.
And finally, a Seder that included Exodus poems by George Oppen, Leonard Cohen, the contemporary Israeli poet Aharon Shabtai, and a modern translator's rendering of an Anglo-Saxon version of The Parting of the Sea.
That, along with lines by the now almost wholly forgotten, but once best-selling bard of Hart Crane's late 1920s, Samuel Hoffenstein.
After the trouble and the tears, after the wraths and the wraiths depart, peace, nurtured by the lonely years, blooms like a cactus in the heart and pierces all.
Usually, ritually, Harold got a kick out of playing the Haggadah's part of the wicked son.
With a wicked smile.
This last year, as we went around the table,
and took turns reading,
it fell to him to be the wise one.
And so he remains.
For some reason that I don't altogether understand, recently, involuntarily, I keep chanting to myself, Wallace Stevens' double vision, really, of Walt Whitman as I interpret it. The first being Tea at the Palots of Hoon, where Walt is identified with the setting sun in all its glory, and then a chant from Like Decorations, where in the very idiom of Walt himself gloriously appears. Not less because in purple I descended the western day through what you called the loneliest air. Not less was I myself. What was the ointment sprinkled on my beard? What were the hymns that buzzed beside my ears? What was the sea whose tide swept through me there? Out of my mind, the golden ointment rained, and my ears made the blowing hymns they heard. I was myself the compass of that sea. I was the world in which I walked, and what I saw or heard or felt came not but from myself. And there I found myself more truly and more strange. In the far south, the sun of autumn is passing like Walt Whitman walking along a ruddy shore. He is singing and chanting the things that are part of him, death and day. Nothing is final, he chants. No man shall see the end. His beard is of fire, and his staff is a leaping flame. What can one say? The overwhelming thing about Walt Whitman is the extraordinary combination of absolute originality on the one hand, and the amazing degree of intimacy that he calls out for in his reader. I cannot think of anyone in the entire history of poetry before or after Walt Whitman who could actually write the following in a little poem called of 1856, To You, Whoever You Are. Whoever you are, I place my hand upon you that you may be my poem. That's stunning. Whoever you are, I place my hand upon you that you may be my poem. He's always drawing you very close to him. Nobody else does that.